Okay, Rabbi said we're on DAF Kuf Tes Vav Amud Aleph, and the top part of the Gemara talks about what vegetable you're supposed to use for karpas, and technically you're allowed to use the same lettuce that you use for maror, but it's better to avoid a safek bracha, so to use a different vegetable. Okay, fine. So so now we're up to Amar Ravina. It's about the 8th line. Amar Ravina, Amar Li Rav Misharshia, Berei de Rav Nasan, Hachi Amar Hillel, Mishmei de Gemara. That Hillel, now this is not the ancient Hillel. This is a Hillel that comes many generations. He's clearly living after the days of the Beis HaMikdash, as you'll see in just a moment. And he has a tradition of this, that what does it say? Lo nichroch inish matzah umar bahadi hadadi v'nechol. A person should not wrap matzah and maror together. See, the irony is that you see clearly he's not the same original Hillel, because the original Hillel was the author of this statement of making the Hillel sandwich. So this is a different Hillel. And he says you shouldn't do that bisman hazeh. Eat matzah and maror together. Mishum desvira lan matzah bisman hazeh deoraisa umaror derabanan va'asi maror derabanan umevato leila matzah deoraisa. He says the reason is like this. He says the truth is that the mitzvah of matzah bisman hazeh is deoraisa. The Torah tells you that there's an obligation to eat matzah that is not contingent upon a korban pesach. So even when you don't have a korban pesach, you have to eat matzah bisman hazeh. But maror is contingent upon having a korban pesach, and therefore, the Gemara will explain this later, and therefore, maror bisman hazeh is only derabanan. If you eat them together, then the maror vis-a-vis the matzah is a non-mitzvah flavor, which ruins the mitzvah flavor of matzah. If you're eating them together and both of them are a mitzvah deoraisa, so then each one has their own intrinsic chashivas, so that even though you can't taste them as well, but the chashivas of the mitzvah sort of makes them each one distinct, so that you can fulfill the mitzvah that way. But when one's a mitzvah and one's not a mitzvah vis-a-vis the other, so then it ruins the flavor of the mitzvah flavor. And therefore that's really what the Gemara says. Vafilu l'man d'amar mitzvos ein mevalo zuazu hani mila deoraisa b'deoraisa u'derabanan b'derabanan aval deoraisa b'derabanan asi derabanan u'maftale deoraisa. He says, and even if you hold that if you do two mitzvahs together that involve eating, and that they don't nullify each other, they don't cancel each other out, that's only when both mitzvahs are deoraisa or both mitzvahs are rabban, they're on equal par, so each one's chashivus maintains its integrity, right? But when one is not a mitzvah, one is a mitzvah, so the one that's not a mitzvah interferes with the integrity of the one that's a mitzvah, and sort of spoils its flavor. Okay. Now, Mantana de Shamaslei mitzvah saying mevatlo zuazu. Who is the Tana who holds that mitzvahs do not cancel each other out? That's Hillel. That's the ancient Hillel, who lives in the times of Bias Hasheni. The Tanya Amrul of al Hillel shaya korchan bevasachas va'ochlan. As they said about Hillel, that he used to wrap the matzah and maror together with the korban pesach, and he would eat them all together. As it says, you shall eat it together with matzah and maror, the korban pesach. And as we've mentioned before, he went to Dr. Lafa, and he took a soft matzah, put lettuce and meat from the korban pesach in it, and that was a delicious meal. That's the Sephardi matzah, Lafa? It's the ancient matzah, and Yemenites today do the same thing. Some Sephardim as well. There's no requirement that the matzah be crunchy. Mm-hmm. If anything, there's actually a downside to the matzah being crunchy, because there's a shaila whether some posts can hold that when a bread is crunchy, it gets a mezainis and not hamotzi. So we do it as a chumrah to prevent chimutz, but Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Cholkin alav chaveirav al Hillel. Rabbi Yochanan says you should know that Hillel's colleagues disagreed with him, and they held that it was not proper to put them together because the mitzvahs would be mevatel each other. Tanya Yachol Yehi Korchan Bevas Achas Ve'ochlan Kederch Shehil Ochlan. You might think that you have to wrap them together and eat them like the way Hillel advocated. Talmud Loimar Al Matzos Umrorim Yocheluhu. So therefore the Torah says, eat it with matzah and moror. And yochluhu, the last letters Hey and Vav, tell me that we're talking about something in the singular, which means eat the Korban Pesach by itself. So that teaches me afilu zeh bifnei atzma v'zeh bifnei atzma, that even if each component is disparate, nevertheless you still fulfill the mitzvah. So maskef lo Rav Ashi ihachi may afilu. So Rav Ashi says the language of afilu is incorrect according to Rabbi Yochanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you're not allowed to eat it as a sandwich because the flavors are mevatel each other. But then the language should not be then you're allowed to even eat it separately. It should be you're required to eat it separately. Right? So therefore, Ella Amar Rav Ashi Haitana Hachi Ketani. So Rav Ashi says that's not the pshat in the Tana. The pshat in the Tana is like this. Yachol lo yatsa v'hu yedei chavoso ela im kein karchan b'vas achas v'ochlan kedech shel oichlan. You might think that the only way you're yotzei the mitzvah is if you eat them as a sandwich the same way that Hillel, because the Torah seems to imply that you have to eat them all together. So Talmud Lomar al matzos umrorim yochluhu afilu zeh bifnei atzma v'zeh bifnei atzma. Okay, so that's really what the Bryce means. That no, even if you eat them separately, you're still fulfilling the mitzvah because of the word yochluhu. The hey vav at the end tells me each component separately is still the fulfillment of the mitzvah. But you see now it's interesting because the Gemara, even though Rav Ashi seems to have challenged adequately Rabbi Yochanan to show that that's not the pshat of the Bryce, Rabbi Yochanan still maintains that according to the Rabbanan who argue with Hillel, you dafka cannot eat it as a sandwich. And so therefore the Gemara says we still have to reckon with that because maybe Rabbi Yochanan has a different way of teaching the Brisa. And therefore, Hashta lo itmar hilchas lo kehil v'lo kirabanan mevarech al achilas matzah v'achel v'hader mevarech al achilas mara v'achel v'hader achel matzah v'chasa v'hadi hadari below bracha zecher l'mikdash kehila. And this is actually the way we do it at our seders. Since we have to be choshesh to the shita of Hillel, but we also have to be choshesh to the shita of the Chachamim that you're not allowed to eat them together. So therefore, what do we do today is that we make a bracha on achilas matzah, eat the matzah separately. We make a bracha on achilas maror, eat the maror separately, and then we eat the Hillel sandwich, Zeichel HaMikdash, to remind us of what was done in the Beis HaMikdash, Kehillel, like Hillel, who holds that you have to eat them together. Now, why is it only Zeichel HaMikdash Kehillel? Because as we said before, Bisman Hazeh, the tam of the maror is mevatel, the tam of the matzah. Because since maror is derabanan and matzah is deoraisa, you have a derabanan being mevatel deoraisa. So it's really Bisman Hazeh, you wouldn't be allowed to eat it as a sandwich in order to fulfill the mitzvah, unless you argue that since today, right, we want to remind ourselves what was done in the Beis HaMikdash, so that's why we do it this way. Alternatively, you could argue that once I've already fulfilled the mitzvah deoraisa of matzah, that moror and matzah are on the same madrega now because I've already fulfilled my mitzvah of achilas matzah, and therefore I can eat them together this way. But anyway, there's a lot of lumdus here that one can...
One bracha?
Mistama Hillel made, that's the good question. Maybe it's not clear. First of all, we don't even know whether the brachas were instituted in the times of Hillel Bichlal, because maybe the brachas were not instituted at all. Birchas HaMitzvahs may not have been instituted in Bayit Sheni. We don't know if they were or not. Maybe they were, I'm not sure. But let's say they were, okay? Let's say they were instituted. It could be he made one bracha and he said, Asher K'shem mitzvahs ha-b'tzivanu le'echol pesach matzah mar.
But would it be one mitzvah or two mitzvahs then? Do we have bundled mitzvahs like that?
Yeah, that's a chiddush in the pasuk. The chiddush in the pasuk is that even though there's a separate mitzvah of matzah and a separate mitzvah of mar, a separate mitzvah of pesach, the Torah wants you to eat them together. So, I'm trying to think, are there other examples of where we do mitzvahs together? Because normally enos in mitzvahs chavilas. It's interesting. Okay, something to think about. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rav Oshia, Kol shetibulo b'mashke tzarech netilas yadayim. Anytime you dip a food, usually it's a vegetable that we're talking about, but any food that is dipped in liquid requires the individual to wash his hands before. Now the reason for this is very practical. We know that the reason why Chazal required us to do Netilas Yadayim before we eat bread is to remind us of what the Kohanim did in the Beis HaMikdash, because Chazal were gozer Yadayim Shnios Ein L'Tumah, that hands automatically that are unwashed have a din of a Sheni L'Tumah, and a Sheni that touches a Shlishi, that touches Kadshim or Truma, becomes Tameh. So even though we don't eat Truma, nevertheless we want to remind ourselves about the way Kohanim used to eat, and so therefore we wash our hands before Netilas Yadayim. Here there's another concern that's very similar to this. If the Chazal were not only gozer that Yadayim Shnios saying, but they were also gozer that if Yadayim that are Shnios touch liquid, the liquid magically becomes a Rishon. Now normally a Sheni can only make a Shlishi. It's a special Takonas Chachamim that they said that a Sheni can make a liquid into a Rishon. It's only Midarabanan. And when I'm dipping a vegetable, let's say, into dressing or gravy or something like that, my fingers may touch the liquid. The liquid then will become a Rishon L'Tumah, and therefore you have a genuine concern, even when it comes to Chulin, you don't want the Chulin to become a Sheni L'Tumah. So therefore, or a Rishon L'Tumah, and so therefore they were said that you always have to wash your hands in order to avoid the problem of the foods that you're eating to become tamei. So Amar Rav Papa Shma Mina, what we can deduce from that halacha is Hai Chasa Tzarech L'Shikue B'Charoses Mishum Kappa. That it's when you're eating the karpas and you're having lettuce, like we said at the top of the DAF, it's permitted to use lettuce for karpas. If you're going to use lettuce for karpas and you want to remove some of the sting by dipping it into charoses, now we don't do that. We dip our karpas, which is a different vegetable, in salt water. But the Gemara is talking about where you're using moror, chasa, moror lettuce, for your karpas as well. And so therefore you want to take the bite off of it, so you're going to dip it into charoses. So you're going to dip it into charoses, and not only going to dip it in charoses, you're going to let it sit in the charoses for a little bit. You need to wash your hands. And basically, Shlamina Hai Chasa, you see that the lettuce has to be dipped in the charoses because of kappa. Now, what kappa means, I'll explain in just a second, but what's the proof? De'isal kadaitach lo tzurich l'shikuye netilas yadayim lamali halo naga. Because if you're going to argue that it's not necessary to dip the lettuce into a charoses, which has liquid. Now, charoses today, I always grew up with charoses that was very dry. But the truth is, charoses is supposed to, you see from this Gemara that charoses is supposed to be liquidy. It's supposed to be floating in a wine base, so that there's liquid there. So, in any event, you see, he says, if you didn't have to dip the vegetable, the karpas vegetable, into a liquid, then it wouldn't be necessary to do netilas yadayim before you eat the moror. The whole reason, the karpas moror, the only reason why you have to wash before karpas is because your hands are shnios and they may touch the liquid, which is a rishon. If there was no liquid involved, then it's no big deal, because since it's chulin, what's the big deal if your hands are shnios? So now let me just explain what kappa is. Why would you have to dip lettuce into kappa? One explanation the Rashbam and Rashi say is because there's a bitterness to the lettuce, and in order to remove the harmful effects of that bitterness, you have to just let it soak for a moment in karpas to remove the edge off of it. But the Rashbam says that he saw another pshat, and that pshat is that sometimes there are worms in the lettuce, and then you soak it in the charoses for a short period of time, so that the worms will die, and presumably, I guess, they'll fall off the lettuce, because it's also usher to eat a dead worm as much as it is. The question is, what then happens with the charos? I guess you can't eat the charoses afterwards. You have to worry maybe there are worms in it.
So how you shake off the charos?
Well, we're going to see that in just a second. That halacha we haven't gotten to yet. We're going to see that momentarily. But the point is that the Rashbam is, it's in a very interesting statement, because normally, we're very makbid on toloim, that you have to make sure that before you even come to the Seder, it's toloim free. But it's mashma from the Rashbam that, all you got to do is look at it, dip it into something to remove the worms, and you're okay to go, which is a little bit strange. But in any event, That's his second pshat. The point is that the Gemara is trying to prove here that that's the reason for Netilas Yadayim, is because you're dipping it and letting it soak into something with a liquid, so your fingers may touch that liquid. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma la'olam eimalacha lo tzarach l'shikuye v'kapa mereicha mayas." The Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily so. Maybe you don't have to dip the lettuce into charoses, and just keeping it nearby the charoses will cause either the bitterness or the worm to die, and that's sufficient. And it doesn't really, you never have to worry about your fingers coming into contact with the liquid. So, elalama li netilas yadayim dilma mashka ulei. But really, then what's the reason you have to wash? Because Chazal said, well, just in case you do dip it in. Not that it's absolutely required, but in the event that it's an option that's open for you, and if you do that, we don't want you to be metame the lettuce and make it, make the liquid into a rishon l'tumah that's going to be floating on the lettuce. So that could be the reason. So you can't necessarily bring a raya from here. But let me just point out something very interesting. One of the reasons why we wash before we eat karpas is for this reason, is because it's a davar shetibulo b'mashke, and according to one opinion in Shulchan Aruch, a davar shetibulo b'mashke requires netilas yadayim, because your fingers may touch the water. So, in my home we use the potato. That's our family minhag. And we have some very polite and etiquette-trained people in my family, so a lot of times we would see people taking a fork and picking a piece of potato with the fork. And you realize that that's actually not correct, because the whole reason for washing is because your fingers may come in contact with the salt. And that's impossible if you're going to dip it with a fork. So you have to be a shtickle grubbish in order to really fulfill the halacha properly.
Can't be a yek on Pesach.
Right, you can't be a yek on Pesach. That's right. The Amar Rav Papa, lo nishi inish mora b'charoses. And this goes to Dr. Shield's point. You're not supposed to allow the morar to soak in the charoses. Why? Because dilma agav chalye de tavlin mevatale lemarure uboinan tamor veleka. He says that because by letting it soak in the charoses, you may be taking all of the sharpness of the morar away. And the whole purpose of the mitzvah of morar, as we'll see momentarily, is you have to taste the bitterness. You have to taste the bitterness of the morar in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Ad b'rei Rav Chisda l'Ravna Ukva v'Dorash. Rav Chisda was once walking in front of Ravna Ukva, and he taught him as follows: No tel yadav b'tibul rishon, no tel yadav b'tibul sheni. That if a person washed his hands for the first dipping, it sounds like he's talking about karpas, he still has to wash his hands for the second dipping, which sounds like for the morah. So Tosfos points out it's not just for morah, it's for the matzah too, because you wash your hands before achilas matzah, and then immediately after achilas matzah you launch into moror. So that's really what it means. That you have to wash your hands twice, once before karpas and once before motzi matzah. So Amru Rabbanan Kamei de Rav Papa Haba Alma Itmar. So when this was repeated over to the Chachamim, they said, well, Rav Chisda must not have been talking about the Seder. He must have been talking about when you're stam in an evening in February, when you're eating a meal. That's when, if you eat one time and you want to eat again, you have to wash your hands a second time. The Isal Kadaita Chacha Itmar Lamalina Tilas Yadayim Trezimni Hamashale Yade Chadazimna. He says, because at the Seder, what's the logic to say that you'd have to wash a second time? You're sitting at the table the whole time. You've already washed your hands once. Why would you have to wash them a second time? So Amrlahu Rav Papa Adarabba Hacha Itmar. Rav Papa says, I say just the opposite. He must have been only talking about the Seder. The Isal Kadaitach Ba'alma Itmar Lamali Trei Tibule. He says, because if you're talking about a regular meal that's not the Seder, then why would you have to why would you have to dip twice? Why is a person dipping twice? Since when does a person dip twice? We only dip twice at the Seder, right? So it sounds like a bit of a strange practice. Normally people dip, they have their Vorspeise, they have their salad, and then they have the meal. Why would you be dipping a second time? So elamai hacha itmar netilas adayim trezim nilamali. So the only alternative is we're talking about the seder. So then why do you have to wash a second time? You already washed the first time. Amri kaven deboy lememar agadata v'halela dilme asuche asche l'daite v'naga. Answers the Gemara. The reason is because there's a hesach hadas between the karpas and the achilas matzah. He says you're saying halel. I mean, you're saying the Haggadah, you're then starting Hallel. There's a lot of stuff going on. You could be touching something unclean. And therefore, we require you to wash your hands the second time before you go into Motzi Matzah and Moror. Amar Rava. Rava now says another halacha. Bola Matzah Yatza, Bola Moror Lo Yatza. If you swallow matzah whole without tasting it, you still fulfill the mitzvah of matzah, because the mitzvah of matzah is the consumption of it, not the tasting of it. But with maror, it's different. Maror, you mamish have to actually taste the bitterness in order to fulfill the mitzvah of remembering your servitude in Egypt through the eating of maror. So, bola matzah umaror, yedei matzah yatsa, yedei maror lo yatsa. If you swallow matzah and maror together, so then you're yotzei matzah, and you're not yotzei maror. Now, it seems strange over here, because now it seems to be contradicting what we learned on Amid Aleph, as far as if you eat matzah and maror together, the maror nullifies the flavor of the matzah. It seems like over here, it's almost better when you swallow the matzah without tasting it at all, because then nothing can nullify its flavor, because you haven't had any flavor at all. You've just consumed it. So this is tzarech iyun gadol. This requires a lot of further discussion, but at least you see over here that you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah even when eating it with something else, as long as you swallow it. But the maror for sure not, you're for sure not yotzei. Now karchan besivu bol on af yudei matzah nami lo yatsa. If you wrap both the matzah and the maror in some kind of tree bark that's very soft, it's almost like paper. If you wrap it up like in a papery kind of substance, then even matzah you're not yotzei, like the Rashbam says, because there was no consumption. It never touches your mouth. It never touches your throat as it's going down. So, like he says, it's like throwing a rock down a flask. It's not called achila anymore. And by the way, some poskim can point to this Gemara. Let's say I have to take a pill for medicinal purposes that contains non-kosher ingredients. So some poskim say, well, listen, it's for refuah, and it's not really eating, so just go ahead and swallow it. But other poskim are machmir, and they say no. You're not supposed to take even things for medicinal purposes if it's got treifa stuff in it. So a solution is to wrap it in paper, so that when you swallow it, you're not there's no contact. There's really no achila. There's no contact with any part of your mouth or your throat until it gets into the stomach, and it's based on this Gemara.
With the maror here, that we eat romaine lettuce, and there's no taste of maror.
No, there is. The maror, romaine still has a bitter aftertaste. That's what they say. I guarantee you, if you try to eat romaine without the salad dressing, it has some kind of little aftertaste to it. Okay. Amar of Shini bar Ashi, matzah lifnei kol echad ve'echad, maror lifnei kol echad ve'echad, v'charos is lifnei kol echad ve'echad. That you should place. Now, the Gemara is describing a social milieu where each person had a little tray that was placed in front of him. It wasn't that you ate all at a table, but just like they have those TV trays, that's the way it was. Every person had a freestanding tray. I don't think they make TV trays anymore, do they? No one watches TV anymore. Right. Maybe they call them computer trays. So anyway, everyone would have their own tray that was brought in front of them, and everyone should have his own matzah, his own maror, his own charoses. Ve'ein okrenes hashulchan ela lifnei mi she'omer haggadah. And when it's time to remove the food from off the table, from off the tray, you only have to remove the Baal Haggadah's tray, meaning the person who's leading the Seder and is going to be saying the Haggadah on behalf of everyone. Now, the reason for removing the tray is so that the children should ask, hey, what's going on? You just started the meal, and now you're taking all the food away. It doesn't make any sense. So this is accomplished by removing it from the leader, because then the children will see the leader. This is happening, and they don't know what's going on. Rav Huna Amar Kulhu Nami Lifnei Misha Omer Haggadah. That Rav Huna says, no, I hold that even the person reciting the Haggadah should have all the food in front of him during the Haggadah. And it seems from Tosfos that the reason is because since he's going to be launching into the brachos immediately after the Haggadah, he's going to say the bracha of Alachilas Matz and Alachilas Morah, you don't want it to be a hefsek between the bracha and the bringing of the food. The Hilchasaka Rav Huna. And the halacha is like Rav Huna, that you leave everything there. Now, the Rashbam says that that's what they used to do back then. But he says, but nowadays, since everyone eats at the table, then what is preferred is that you should just put everything either at a side of the table, or do something else that, like the Rashbam over here says. One second. לפני מי שאומר הגדול לבדו, וכן לכל אחד, אבל אנו מסלקן את הקערה שבמצה מורר, שני תבשילן לסוף השולחן, ודי לנו בכך. He says, what we do is we just move the ka'ara, the Pesach tray, and the food, we put it on one end of the table. A lot of people cover it, which is a minhag as well. Now, lama okrin es hashulchan. Why do we remove the table? In other words, going according to the reasoning of lifting off the tray so that the children should ask. That's the reason. The reason is that we want the children to be able to see what's going on, and they should ask, hey, manishtana, why is this night different? He saw that that they took away the tray from Rabbah. Now Aryai was a child. He grew up in Rabba's house, so Aryai was probably a child when this episode happened. Amar lahu adain lo ka'achlinan atu ka mi'akri taka mikaman. So Aryai says, I don't understand. We haven't even eaten yet, so they've come and they've taken away the tray away from us. Why is that? So Amar le Rabba patrasan milomar manishtana. You've exempted us from asking the manishtana formally because you've asked it informally by asking, why is this night different? What's going on? Amar Shmuel, lechem oni. The Torah calls matzah the bread of oni. So what does oni mean? Lechem sha'onin alav dvarim. It's a bread that elicits or evokes a lot of response. So the word oni is from the word oneh, to respond. Tanya nami hachi lechem oni lechem shonen love dvarim harbi. The Brisa says this as well, that it evokes a lot of response, a lot of discussion to remind us of why we're eating this bread. Davar acher lechem oni oniksiv. Another explanation of what lechem oni means is that it comes from the word oni because it's written without the vav in the Torah, and oni is a poor man. Ma oni shadarko biprusa avkan biprusa. And just like a poor man eats a broken loaf of bread because he saves part of it for later, so too, when you eat the matzah at the night of the Seder, you're supposed to eat one of the pieces of matzah supposed to be broken, which is why we have 3 matzahs at the Seder. You need 2 shleimim for lechem mishnah, and you need a prusa to signify that this is lechem oni, that this is the lechem of a poor man. And that's why we break the middle matzah, half of it for the afikomen and half of it for the mitzvah of motzi matzah.
What is the grad? Do we only have 2 matzahs?
I don't know. You have to show me we'll have to look it up. Davar acher, take a look in the, what is it, the Bir Hagra, he says it? Okay. Davar acher, I have a Graz Haggadah at home, maybe I'll try and take a look. Davar acher, ma darko shel ani hu masik v'ishto ofa, Afkanami hu masik v'ishta ofa. Another reason why it's called lechem oni is because the bread of a poor man is bread that doesn't have time to rise, because a poor man can't afford the fuel to fire up his oven and leave it burning for several hours while the bread is baking. So he tells his wife, quickly light up the oven, and then as soon as she has it lit, he slaps the dough on the side of the oven so it'll bake quickly, because otherwise the fire will go out because he has such a meager amount of fuel. Okay, we'll hold it here for today.